Real quick to start with, just to let you guys know that Dana is down in Alabama. Her dad's numbers on the cancer all seem to be looking good. That's going in the way that the direction it's supposed to. He was having some negative reaction side effects that are somewhat expected to the treatment itself. And so she went down there to help his. He got really dehydrated. He wasn't eating. He was really lethargic and kind of depressed. So they took him. They finally convinced him that he needed to go in. So they took him to the ER. They got those levels up. He went back home, but then his blood pressure was staying low. So they took him back in. He was admitted last night. I think his numbers are looking good. In addition to all of that. A couple of days ago, Dana's uncle, her mother's brother, passed away. It was not unexpected. It's something that has been coming for a while, but still hard with all these other things going on too. So there's going to be a funeral for that this week. So if you could keep their family in your prayers, Dana and her dad and her mom and everybody who's kind of affected by that, I know they would appreciate it. You know Dana, her family's last name is Hinkle, so if you would pray for that family, we would really, really appreciate it. We're going to finish up today our 3-week series on gratitude. I'll remind you that it's paired with what we're calling a 21-day gratitude challenge. There are some reasons why we make it 21 days. One of them is that the guy who developed the science of gratitude says that's about how many days you need to practice it before you can really see the lasting effects of it. Psychology also tells us that it takes about 21 days to establish anything as a habit in your life. If you do it consistently for that long, you just sort of start automatically doing it. It starts to become second nature. So that's the idea. And I told you before that my idea is not that you will go through these activities, which is 7 activities, one for every day of the week, and then you loop it and do it again the next week, and then you loop it and do it again the next week. But my idea is not that you'll get done with that and you say, okay, now I'm going to do all these activities in my life all the time. No, you're not, because some of them are going to really resonate with you and some of them aren't. And they aren't going to be the same ones for each one of you. So part of the design is that you can try all of these different activities, and maybe you'll find the ones that resonate with you and some that you don't, so that you're not going to mess with. That's fine. Focus on the ones that do, because this needs to be a way of life. It may be that you go through these and you say, you know what, there's some benefit to that, but for me, for my family, I think if we did it this way, and you come up with something that I didn't even suggest, fantastic, great. That's something that'll be yours, your family's. That could be your own tradition, and that's really, really cool. The idea that your children could actually even start passing this down as a way of life, as a part of what it means to be somebody who bears your name or is related by blood in that way, that we are, whatever else we are grateful people. We have gone through practices to make sure that we cultivate gratitude in our hearts, because we want to be grateful to God. We want to be grateful to the people around us. We want to be grateful people because we believe that that's what we're called to be. As a matter of fact, if you've been paying attention in the last 2 weeks, I've really tried to make a case that a lot of the things that we are called to do, a lot of the commands that seem sort of impossible if you just read them as commands, the thing that the Bible actually lays in as the sort of thread that runs through it all, that makes it possible, actually is gratitude and thanksgiving, to the point that it almost seems repetitive. Like in very short spaces where the Apostle Paul, for example, is talking about all these things that we're called to do and be, he keeps mentioning gratitude like a lot, like every other sentence, because he wants you to know how interwoven it is. Now, I got some stuff we're going to do to finish it up. If you are doing the gratitude practices, we are sending out a digital version every day, or I'm trying to. There was one day I missed it. I caught up. But we are doing that, and I also sent out like a full packet. If you'd rather just print the whole thing out, have the whole thing to do in paper, fine. We're doing that. I've also got some in the back that you can pick up. And if you just don't have one and you want one later, just text me or something, and I'll send you one. And if you hadn't started, if this is the first you're hearing about it, fine, start. There's no reason to feel guilty about that. The days aren't special. I put it around Thanksgiving. But being grateful people, that's something we're called to do all the time. Now, real quick, audience participation. It's real early. We're all still adjusting to daylight saving time, even though this is the one that should give you an extra hour of sleep. It's my favorite. Um, except for when it gets like dark at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Um, I need 2 volunteers. Now, good, you knew. You don't volunteer before you find out what you're volunteering for. Because honestly, if everybody just threw their hands up eagerly, I just would have made something up. And then we would come back to the thing I want to do. Just real quick and easy, what I want you to do is I'd like 2 people who are willing to and it doesn't have to be from something that you did in a gratitude exercise this week or anything, but just very briefly be able to say, you know what, in my life, as I'm thinking about it, I am grateful to this person who is a part of our church, and I mean this church, because of something that they did for you. Who would be willing to share something like that? I did not set any shields. I did not set up anybody. So you're grateful to someone in this church or someone in your family. Let me make it easy. There you go. That's cool. And what I like about that, besides the fact that it was this honest thing, I kind of like that it was from something a long time ago, and I like that you were specific. That it wasn't, I'm thankful because you're good people and I've been around you for a while and thank you for the goodness that you are being. It was, hey, you guys did this. You did a specific thing. Implied is, and you didn't have to do that. You chose to. You chose to do this good, and it mattered to me. And it mattered to me in this way. Do you see how powerful that is? It was simple. We didn't write a poem. I mean, if you want to write a poem, great. That's fantastic. But it was just the statement of it. It was just saying it. It was just a notation of it. So Tiffany gets a little book of gratitude because she was willing. Now, it won't be a surprise to the next person, but I need one more person. Somebody in your family or in the church that you're grateful for something that they provided in your life. I would prefer that it was not me. They can't see you. Look at all the hands that went down. And probably not Tally since I gave her a book last week. So, one more person. You, with the name. Mm-hmm. So, so, so you're grateful for their bad estimation skills. No, that's cool because you have people, and yeah, it's neat to have people that you already know and have a different relationship with who are living close to you now. It's really cool when they decide to be neighbors in a way beyond just you live close to us. That they say, hey, whoops, we did it again. And one of the things that we do with that is we share it with our friends, and knowing that you're the friends that happens to. That's very cool. And it implies some stuff about the relationship. And again, specific, not general. That's really cool. So Morgan gets a copy of The Little Book of Gratitude by Dr. Robert Emmons. Now, if the rest of you want a Little Book of Gratitude by Dr. Robert Emmons, they're available on Amazon, and they're dirt cheap. You really can get them really easily. If you want to follow along with the sermon notes in your phone or tablet or whatever in the YouVersion Bible app, you can do that. You open up that app, you go into the menu, events, North Augusta Church, that's us. So this week is Thanksgiving. If you were not aware of that, you might want to go ahead and start cooking your turkey now. I don't really understand how that works, but it takes a while, so you need some prep time. And because that's the reason we're doing a Thanksgiving challenge, Thanksgiving gratitude lessons. That's somewhat obvious, and I used to sort of chafe at things like that, but I've really, in the last several years, really come to the position that we need in our year these set times to remind us of things that we need to be reminded of. And so it's good to remember, even at Christmas, that Christ came into the world and that God was incarnated and remind ourselves of that part of the story. It's good to remind ourselves of the resurrection at Easter because those are magic holy days. No, but they can be holy if we decide to, or if we decide to remember those things every day, that's holy too. That's great. Romans is very specific about that, that you have your own choices. But I know in my life, I need to be reminded of important things that I know. You understand what I'm saying? It's not that it's new information, but I need to be reminded because I go on autopilot. I get complacent. The urgent takes over and pulls our attention away from the important. And so that's kind of why I want to look at that. I did want to talk just about our celebration of Thanksgiving real quick going into it. I know Magali put some stuff in the bulletin about it too. So, synergy. Thanksgiving was not mandated by Scripture. I mean, the idea of being thankful is, but having a particular day that you celebrate in America, obviously not there. It wasn't even celebrated every year until 1863. When Abraham Lincoln proclaimed that it would be celebrated annually on the last Thursday in November. That lasted for about 75 years until FDR changed it to appease retailers who were complaining that it would interfere with the Christmas shopping season. He declared that it would be celebrated on the second to last Thursday in November, which caused a great deal of confusion and even outrage among some people. In 1940, to clear up the confusion and contention over the holiday, Congress declared that it would be celebrated annually on the fourth Thursday in November. My point is this. It's a great opportunity for you to cultivate and reinforce gratitude in your own life. It is not an opportunity to gripe about how other people aren't celebrating it as you or I see fit. It's actually impossible to feel entitlement and gratitude at the same time. If you feel you are entitled to everybody celebrating this event in a particular way to appease you, then you're not going to be grateful through the whole thing. It's just you can't do those two things at the same time. It actually is psychologically impossible. There's an author named David Steindl-Rast, and he is very into the idea and especially the spiritual aspect of gratitude. He says, and I think this is an important distinction to go in as we're starting out, it is not joy that makes us grateful. It is gratitude that makes us joyful. Let me say that again. It is not joy that makes us grateful. Part of the thing that we get in our head, and it's sort of low key, so it's not one of those things that we say out loud all that much, but we think, well, sure, I would be grateful if more good stuff to be grateful for what was happening in my life. If there was more joy in my life, how could I help but be grateful? But I'm going to argue scripturally, and I'm going to argue psychologically, which I have a bit of cred to do from both angles. It just ain't the way it works. It just isn't. What we find is that the more that people cultivate and practice gratitude, tangible gratitude practices. Again, I'm doing 3 weeks on this, but you need to understand that if all you do is listen to me talk for 3 weeks, even if you like it and agree with it, and you don't do any of it, it won't have any effect in your life. Just agreeing with stuff doesn't make you grateful. But what we find through all kinds of tradition and frankly through the science now is that people who practice tangible gratitude practices in their lives are more joyful people. They are more joyful people. Now, that comes from a number of different directions that happens. One of them is these kind of things actually do change your brain chemistry. It is observable. People that study that have studied it, and it turns out it does change your brain chemistry in a positive way. I've told you before, I'll mention it again because it's just such a profound thing to me. Writing one gratitude letter, one, to somebody, can be alive or dead. If they're alive, you should share it with them. Not anything long or overwrought, but something that talks to a particular person, talks about the thing they did that you knew that they didn't have to do, talks about how it impacted you. And then you send it to them, or you have coffee or lunch with them, and you sit down and you read it to them, and you have a conversation. Or if they've already passed away, maybe you just read it out loud after you've written it, but it gets communicated. That action, one of those, has Similar effects to several popular antidepressants, only the effect lasts for about 6 months. Don't take my word for it, you can look it up. This stuff changes you. And what we find is that the people who are tangibly practicing gratitude actually are more joyful people. Brene Brown goes so far as to say that in all of her work and research, she never has found a single person who would describe their lives as joyful who was not practicing tangible gratitude practices. Not one. So it's pretty important. I'm reminded when we're talking about this, and I'll tell the short version of the story so you can be thankful for that. A lot of you know Kenny Payne, missionary over in Ukraine. He's been here to speak several times. He's pretty important in my life, has ended up being one of my mentors and a very, very good friend. But I kind of knew Kenny Payne from working at a camp when I was in college. And one summer, when I decided that I was going to become a youth minister, I went to Kenny and I said, "Hey, man, are you guys still doing like a summer internship for youth ministers?" And he kind of laughed. He goes, "Funny you should ask, man, because actually they cut that from." But let me explain one thing real quick. In the southeastern United States, if somebody hires a youth ministry intern, if they're a very large church with a staff, then that's probably a situation where they get to come in and work under a youth minister, and they get training, and they get to shadow them, and they see how that works, and they learn how to be a youth minister. In the majority of churches that are not super large churches with staffs, what that means is, hey, we get a cheap youth minister for a summer. Sure, he's completely unqualified, but hey, he's cheap. So I asked Kenny about this, and he goes, it's funny. This is the first year that they've cut the youth ministry intern from our budget and gave me a raise. And so I kind of laughed, and we'll chalk this up to immaturity and brashness. And I said, well, you just go back and talk to him because you're going to have one that's going to be me. So go work that out. And he just kind of smiled and said, okay, and I didn't think anything else about it. And then like a week later, Kenny calls me, and he says, hey, we got that internship worked out. I was like, oh, cool. Didn't even think anything about it. So I went and did the internship. Not only was it the summer, which is normally 10 weeks, he extended it. I ended up staying there like 9 months. Paid the whole time. There was a little apartment they built on the church. I lived in it. Side note, living in churches is kind of creepy, even if you like churches. Later, I found out through means that he meant for me never to know this. Later, I found out that the way Kenny had worked that out is he went back to the elders and told them that he was just going to pay my salary with his new raise. And not only did he do that for the 10 weeks of the summer, he continued to do it for 9 months and was really working to figure out how to do it longer term than that. Now, Kenny absolutely did not have to do that. He didn't even want me to know that he had done it. But it was a kindness. It's something that I'm incredibly grateful for. Not only that, instead of me just being the cheap youth minister, Kenny had actually been a youth minister before, and he actually invested in me. He took me around. He let me shadow him doing really, really difficult things with the church, and we talked through all of it. It was a fantastic experience. But every bit of that was something that he chose to do that, as cocky as I was, I never even would have dared to ask another person for that. And I've been incredibly grateful my whole life. I hold Kenny Payne in incredibly high regard. And not just because of the thing that he did or that I got money, though that was nice, but because of the heart that decides to do something like that. It's not just something that didn't cost him anything. It literally cost him a lot. And I've been grateful. And I care a lot about the things that Kenny Payne says to me now, because he speaks from a place. I live in gratitude to him. And we've all got stories like that. I've got more stories like that. Dr. Emmons says this. He says, gratitude engages at least 3 different aspects of the mind. We intellectually recognize the benefit, we willingly acknowledge this benefit, and we emotionally appreciate both the gift and the giver. The term gift is important in this context because gifts are unearned things that we are not owed by the giver and to which we are not entitled. Listen, Check out this transition. I love Matthew McConaughey as an actor. I mean, he always plays Matthew McConaughey, but I like that. So I think he is all right, all right, all right. But a few years ago at a award show, he got up, and in his speech where he's thanking all these people in his life, he does this thing, and it got shared a whole lot. And I actually appreciate the sentiment I think he was trying to make. But he did this whole thing about, I want to thank myself. And then went into all the work that he did, and da-da-da-da. I'm grateful to myself. And here's the thing. Yeah, you should believe in yourself. You should do hard things. You can be glad that you did. But gratitude, to be gratitude, has to acknowledge a giver outside of yourself. You understand? You have to acknowledge a giver outside of yourself. A lot of times that's God, a lot of times that's other people, a lot of times it's both. But it has to acknowledge the gift itself, the giver that gave it to you. It has to acknowledge that it was a gift, meaning it's not something you earned, it's not something you're entitled to, because if you feel that way, you literally, psychologically cannot be grateful for it. If you receive something because you feel entitled to it, you can't be grateful for it. If you receive something because you feel like you've earned it, you can't be grateful for it. You can be glad. You can be thankful to God that the opportunity was there. But it ain't gratitude unless you are acknowledging an outside giver. And you're acknowledging that it was not something that they had to do, that it was unmerited favor, gifts or grace. Turn, if you will, James chapter 1, starting verse 16. James chapter 1, starting in verse 16. To the other Christians, James says, "Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows." James says, don't be deceived, which implies there are forces out there that would be trying to deceive you about this thing, right? You don't tell people not to be deceived if nobody's trying to deceive them. I'm not going to say, except for comic effect, hey, when you guys go out to your cars, be sure you don't step in any lava. Why? No lava. It's not going to come up. So if I tell you don't be deceived, I'm at least implying that in your life there are forces that are trying to deceive you on this point. So what's the point? Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. Now, who would be trying to lie about that? You know, sometimes it's cynical. Sometimes I look at the suffering in the world and the things that are wrong and the horrible things that are still taking place. And then I'll flip on Facebook because I'm an idiot. I'll bring up on Facebook. You don't actually flip on Facebook. And I'll see the people thanking God for the great parking place they got at the mall. I remember about the starving children or the children that have been stolen from their houses so they can be used in armies to kill. They'll thank God that the sun shined just the perfect way so that on their vacation they got this one super cute shot that they could share on Instagram. And I'll remember that with the clean water crisis in the world today, that entire crisis could be solved with the money that Americans spend on ice cream in 1 year. And so I'll start to get grumpy about everything that people are thanking, the little insignificant things that people are thanking God for. And I don't remember what actually precipitated it, but one day when I was in one of those spirals, I think probably it was just the Holy Spirit going, okay, I'm tired of this. He nudged me, and I remember this verse, so I had to go look it up, see if I was remembering it right. See, because it turns out that James says, hey, don't be deceived. Think about it like this. What if you just assumed that every good thing that happens in your life, in some sense, came from God? And you can do this because God is the giver of good gifts. God is good. He is the giver of good gifts, and he does not change like shifting shadows. What doesn't he change about? Well, in this context, the goodness and the giving. It's specific content. What if you just assumed that when something good happens in your life, that the source of it in some sense, and this is not to the other exclusion of people who partner with God to make that thing in your life happen, you need to be grateful to them too, but what if we just assumed that it always was from God? And what if sometimes the parking place was just coincidence? Great, that's the right mistake to make. Wouldn't you rather be too grateful to God? And are you picking up on how silly that sounds when I say it? Wouldn't you rather operate in the realm of gratitude? Just assuming that this living and active God is bringing good things into your life, especially if you believe that the God who blesses you is doing that instrumentally so that you can be a blessing to the rest of the world. It turns out that cynicism that I'm so prone to really doesn't do a whole lot of good in the world, or a lot of good in me. It turns out that if we start giving into that kind of cynicism and it starts to change the lenses that we're looking at the world and interpreting the world through, what happens is we start to rule out things that God may have been involved in that are actually good, and we even stop registering them as good in the first place. Or we start to think of ourselves as lucky. What if we were the kind of people who just assumed that we live in this world and we have a living and active God who is still living and active, who loves us, who made us on purpose in his own image, who's taking the story somewhere beautiful, and who is right now in our lives bringing about the good that's taking place in the world? What if part of even our evangelism was to talk to people and not just to say, here's all the stuff that you don't know, and once you know this, then God will come into your life? What if we said, hey, even if you don't know any of this thing that happened that was so good, I believe that was from God, and here's why. What if your job is to point out the goodness that's already there? The ways that God is already involved, because God already loves them. I'm willing to bet that people who had truly cultivated gratitude couldn't help but help other people to see those things too. This is a different way to live. This basic assumption that attributes everything good to God, all good gifts to God in some sense, and if you're mistaken, make the mistake in that direction. But that assumption changes everything. In the little book of gratitude, which some of you can open up and read along with, Dr. Emmons says, grateful living is possible only when we realize that other people and agents do things for us that we cannot do for ourselves. Gratitude emerges from two stages of information processing: affirmation and recognition. We affirm the good and credit others with bringing it about. In gratitude, we recognize that the source of goodness is outside of ourselves. You hear me? It has to be this acknowledgement that the source of goodness is outside of ourselves, that this is being enacted upon us. Romans chapter 8, starting verse 26. Romans chapter 8, starting in verse 26. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose. This has become one of my favorite passages in Scripture, and it kind of surprised me, kind of snuck up on me the way that it became that. It's after this beautiful, even poetic passage that Paul writes that pictures even creation itself being sort of dissatisfied with the state of things, this already but not yet kind of state of things, where there's still darkness and there's still brokenness, but the kingdom of God, the harmony, the light is breaking in, and we're in the tension of this place. And Paul points out that it's like creation itself is groaning, yearning for God to make good on his promises, for God to reveal what we will be, because creation itself, in some sense, has that same promise of renewal. It's gorgeous, it's inspiring. And then he comes back and hits this note, because this is a part of it too. He reminds us that that Holy Spirit, part of the Trinity that now dwells within us, both individually and in us as a body. The Bible talks about it both ways. That part of what that Spirit is doing is in those moments where we're so crushed and we're so broken and we can't see the light. And there's a part of us that feels like we need to pray, but there's a part of us that doesn't even want to, and the part of us that doesn't know what we would say if we could get up the energy. Have you ever been there? Or maybe we're just so racked with sadness and sorrow that we can't get the thoughts together in the first place. Paul reminds us that in those moments, God himself, that part of the Godhead called the Holy Spirit, has taken up residence in us and is searching our hearts to provide the prayer to himself. In contrast with all of the other God stories and sacrificial systems, the way that they worked was they thought that the gods mostly didn't like them, or at least were indifferent. And so you give them gifts, and you do all this other stuff. You put yourself in discomfort. You do all this elaborate things, so maybe you'll get the God's attention, and they'll get off your back or maybe grant you a wish. But you got to do it right, because they are finicky. Instead of looking to be appeased, this God looks down and reminds us, no, I took up residence inside you because there are going to be moments where you can't even come up with words, where you're so overwhelmed with the emotions that you do not know what to pray to me. And because my relationship with you, because you yourself are so important to me, I'm not going to look for you to come up with the right words or follow the right formula in that time. Because I'm invested in you, I'm going to search your heart and find the prayer myself. And I'm going to tell you, on the night before my dad's funeral, when I'd been autopiloting it real nice up to that point, writing stuff, getting pictures, knocking stuff out. I had Dana, that really helped any of those things happen, but I was clipping through it. And we laid down in bed that night, and the dam broke loose. I have never in my entire life cried like that, felt that kind of sorrow, felt that kind of loss. I couldn't come up with words to say to Dana. I couldn't come up with words to say to God. And Dana just held me and let me do it. And thank God for her. But I'm going to tell you, and maybe this is silly to tell you this, because in some sense I think it's the only thing the kind of thing you only know by experience. But over the course of the time, and it was a decent amount of time that night, that I was just falling apart, or at least that's what it felt like, something happened. A peace did come that had nothing to do with understanding. Somehow in the middle of that, I started being able to fondly remember my dad and even smile and even laugh a little bit through the tears. Somewhere in the middle of that, and some of this may have come from Dana being kind of God's hands on me at that point. So don't ever let those opportunities pass. But somehow in the middle of it, I felt not alone. And not even alone in my sorrow, while God, I believe, was receiving my dad to him, my God still felt my sorrow in it. Now, am I never sad about that anymore? No, I'm sad about it a lot. I'm just telling you, God didn't sit around and wait for me to be able to clear my head, do a meditation practice so that I have the right words to say to him, and if I got it right, then God's going to show up. God held me and said, I got you. God searched my heart for the prayer that I didn't know how to pray. That's the relationship we have with God. That's who this God is. And you find that even in the midst of these dark times of suffering, even when things that you don't understand, or even when somebody else's actions that are evil affect you. Are you thankful that they did those things? Are you thankful those things happened? Not exactly. Let me see if I can illustrate it like this. Right before she started high school, Chloe broke her jaw. The story of how it happened is so stupid that we've tried to come up with better stories. We were watching TV. She was laying in our bed with us. We're watching TV. She decides she wants a popsicle. She gets up to go get the popsicle, steps down on the little cedar chest, and then goes to step on the floor and forgets that there was a stool there, falls on the floor, breaks her jaw. I've got x-rays. If you really want to be disturbed, I can show them to you. I did not put them on the slide this time. I did when it happened. Now, what you may or may not know is up until that point, Chloe had kind of a crossbite going that they were saying we can't really fix it with braces. We could do a surgery where we have to break her jaw. We're like, we don't want to do that. And it turns out that after all the jaw breaking and the wiring shut and the realigning and the da-da-da-da, her smile's perfect now. Like it lines up. There is no crossbite. It was incredibly effective. I do not recommend the method. I am not thankful that that happened. At the same time, some really good stuff came out of it. Now, we can do that for that kind of thing, right? We can say, oh, that was an awful thing. I would never have that happen again. I don't even like to think about it. I don't even like to remember it. But this good thing happened. This good thing came out of it. And I am grateful that even in the midst of that horrible thing, there were some good things that happened. It's the same thing. It's the same thing. This is a hard time with Dana's family. It's hard seeing her dad not feeling well like this. He's always been this big, go-get-it kind of guy, and to see him hurting is hard. Losing her uncle is hard. It all happening together is hard. I don't recommend it. At the same time, there's already all kinds of beauty that comes out of it. There's all kinds of moments of grace that come out of it. I'm telling you that gratitude matters even in and maybe especially in times of suffering and loss. And yeah, when you get to that, you can say, okay, I need to pull it together, so I need to start practicing gratitude, and that'll have some good benefit. But what I'm telling you more than that is, being the kind of person who has already cultivated gratitude in your life better prepares you to go through it. Better prepares you to process it. Better prepares you to see the good that is there in the midst of the awful. Dr. Emmons explains it like this. He says, gratitude can also be a response to unmerited evilness. While we most often link gratitude in our minds with pleasant outcomes, gratitude is not an infrequent response, even in the midst of horrendous trauma and tragedy. My work has led me to interview people who have suffered terrible illness and loss, including the events of September 11th and the destructive hurricanes that hit the southeastern United States in 2005. Even in the face of such terrible adversity, it is possible to be grateful for a benefit one has received. And more important, people who experience gratitude in such dire circumstances consistently report that they are happier than those who do not, and are less susceptible to negative emotions and outcomes. It is this presence of thankfulness in trying times that enables us to conclude that gratitude is not simply a form of positive thinking or a technique of happyology, but rather a deep and abiding recognition and acknowledgement that goodness exists even under the worst that life offers. We're called to be a whole lot of things. But a very real part of it is people of faith are called to be the people who believe that goodness still exists even in the midst of the worst that life has to offer. I'm not calling you to put our heads in the ground and ignore suffering. That doesn't help anybody. I'm just saying we're the people who have been supposed to be cultivating this way of being grateful in the world. And when we go into it, we're not the obnoxious toxic positivity person with somebody else's sorrow. But we are the people who have the lenses to see. We see the darkness, we see the suffering, we also see the points of light. We also see the opportunities to breathe life in. We don't feel like we have to answer anything. That's not the point, and it doesn't help. We're the people who stand with people who are having trouble standing. We're the people who don't turn away from the suffering but enter into it. We're the people who believe that our sufferings have prepared us to be a lifeline in those sufferings. We believe that we can be grateful even in the midst of evilness because good still exists. Let's finish up here. Luke chapter 17, starting in verse 11. Luke chapter 17, starting in verse 11. Now, on his way to Jerusalem, Jesus traveled along the border between Samaria and Galilee. As he was going into a village, 10 men who had leprosy met him. They stood at a distance and called out in a loud voice, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." When he saw them, he said, "Go show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were cleansed. One of them, when he saw that he was healed, came back, praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him, and he was a Samaritan. Jesus asked, "Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Rise and go. Your faith has made you well." Now, it's an interesting story, and we rightfully look on in disbelief at the 9 lepers who did not return. Let me set the stage just a little bit. Leprosy was a terrible disease at the time. It is a disease that still exists today. They don't call it leprosy because it freaks people out. They call it Hansen's disease. What is Hansen's disease, you might ask? Leprosy. Now, we have treatments for it today that didn't exist back then. It's not curable, but it is treatable. And so people are able to live very normal lives, not being contagious, that kind of thing. But it is something that still exists in the world. Part of the problem with leprosy is the people wind up being very disfigured, especially at the time, because they lose sensitivity. And so they wind up injuring themselves and not knowing it in all kinds of ways. I won't get into the gross ways that happens, but they wind up being very disfigured, and there's a lot of fear around it at the time. And so they weren't allowed to live. If you got leprosy, you weren't allowed to live in the town anymore, not allowed to live with your family anymore. They had these leper colonies out there. If you had to go into town for anything, you had to be all covered up, and you yell out, "Unclean, unclean," everywhere you go, so everybody knows to go away from you. Horrible, horrible way to live. And so these lepers, 10 lepers, are going through town, and they see Jesus. They apparently have some idea of who he is because they call out to him from a distance. And they say, "Jesus, Master, have pity on us." Now, Jesus' move here is interesting to me because he doesn't do what we expect Jesus to do. I don't know why we expect Jesus to do it because he doesn't really do it a whole lot. We expect him to go, "All right, everybody gather around. Got an opportunity to show the power of God, so you guys will listen to what I say. So everybody, I'm going to bring these 10 lepers in. I'm going to lay my hands on them, show I'm not scared. There'll be a light show, maybe some smoke. Then you'll all believe and you'll listen to whatever I have to say." That's not what happens. They call out to him from across the street, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." From across the street, Jesus goes, let me get his words right. "Go and show yourselves to the priest." So Jesus doesn't touch them, doesn't come up to them, says, "Go and show yourselves to the priest," which sounds kind of weird, except for there's a provision for that. If you have somehow been cleansed of leprosy, it's actually in the old law. The process was you would go to the priest, they would examine you, and the priest would declare that this person is clear of this disease. And then they would be able to reintegrate into society. So Jesus tells them to go ahead and do the thing that people who have been cleansed of the disease do. They don't have a big discussion about it. All 10 apparently just start going toward the priest, and I don't know if you caught this sentence, it's easy to miss. 14, when Jesus saw them, he said, go show yourself to the priests. And as they went, they were cleansed. The situation is not, Jesus said, hey, go show yourself to the priest. And then there was a light, and they went, whoa, no leprosy. All right, we'll go see the priest. That's not what happened. According to the text, they said, okay, and started walking. And as they walked toward the priest, they got de-leprosyized. You should not make up words while you're talking. They were cured. They were healed. They go and show themselves to the priest. Apparently, they get pronounced clean. And then what happens next? One of them, when he was healed, came back praising God in a loud voice. He threw himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him. And then here's another one of those things that just seems kind of shoehorned in, doesn't it? And he was a Samaritan. Why does it matter if it's a Samaritan? It's like those people who tell you stories, and they always have to insert the race of the other person, even if it has nothing to do with the story. Except for it's not that, because it actually has a lot to do with the story. See, one of them came, and the Bible goes out of its way to point out that he was a Samaritan that did this, that returned to offer praise to God. The Samaritans were, and this is sort of an overgeneralization, but it'll give you the picture. They were a race of people that were created by the Jews going out and intermarrying with other cultures, and their religion became this hodgepodge buffet-style religion of a little bit of everything. And the Jews did not like them at all. They disliked them so much that their affectionate name for them was to just refer to them as dogs. And they would go miles and miles and miles out of their way on a trip just to not go through their dirty, stinking town. So the one that came back, Luke tells us, was a Samaritan. Jesus' response is a little bit like our response. We're not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has no one returned to give praise to God except for this foreigner? And then he says to him, the Samaritan, rise and go, your faith has made you well. Now, here's what's a little bit lost on us that I promise you was not lost on Jesus' initial audience. To say that he was a Samaritan, for Jesus to come back and say, whoa, 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 the only one that came back was this foreigner, is to imply that the other 9 were observant Jews. They were observant Jews who knew their story. They were observant Jews who knew their scripture. They were observant Jews who had worshiped and participated in worshiping the one true God, who should know. They're observant Jews who asked Jesus for help. When Jesus gives them the thing to do, they walked toward the priest feeling really dumb to do it at first, and as they went, they saw that they were getting healed. They were healed by the time they got there. They saw this happen. The priest, they interacted with the priest. He declared them clean and sent them back into the lives that they thought were lost to them. And the observant Jews who had the pre-established relationship with God and a lifetime of practicing worshiping this God all went right back into their life without saying thank you to the God who had made them, who had healed them. And the Samaritan with the buffet-style religion actually comes back to Jesus and thanks God for what had happened. We rightfully look on in disbelief at the 9 lepers who didn't return. We ask ourselves, how in the world could it only be the foreigner, only the person who was not a part of temple worship, didn't go to the synagogue, none of that happened? How can he be the guy who comes back and recognizes God's hand and thanks him? When we realize all that, then our judgment becomes even more. We're even more outraged. How could you guys miss it? How could you let that guy show you up, the Samaritan that you guys look down on? Put a little bookmark in your mind there. There's a guy named A.J. Jacobs. I like him. He's a funny guy to read. He started out as a journalist. Jacobs has this little shtick he does to write books. And it's surprisingly effective. He'll do a thing, and he'll do it like to the extreme to make a point, and he'll do it for a series of days, and then he'll write an article or a book about it. He's done it one of the earlier things he did was called Mr. Know-It-All. He wrote a book called Mr. Know-It-All. He read all of his like the whole set of encyclopedias, and just kind of reported his life as he was doing this, and kind of how it played out. There's one thing, I think this was an article, he decided to outsource everything in his life to make write a story about outsourcing. He included things like arguments with his wife. I'm not sure he would recommend it as a good thing to do, but it did make for a funny article. So he does this stuff all the time. He wrote a book several years ago that's interesting. It was called The Year of Living Biblically. And he took this same approach. Now, Jacobs will describe himself as an agnostic Jew. He is ethnically Jewish. I think his family was somewhat observant when he was growing up, but as an adult, he has not been observant at all. And he's just sort of agnostic about the question of God. And because his background is Jewish, when he says biblical, the year of living biblically, he primarily means the Old Testament. And so what he did is he went and tried to, for a year, to live as literally as he could from what the biblical text commanded. Down to not wearing clothing of mixed fibers, down to not trimming the corners of your beard after he did a lot of work figuring out what the corners of your beard were. He talked about one time being out in like the park in New York, and some guy comes up to him and asks what he's doing because he clearly looks just nuts. And the guy said, explain the project, and I'm trying to live biblically, and da-da-da. And he goes, doesn't the Bible command you to stone adulterers? And Jacob goes, yeah, it says that. And the guy goes, I'm an adulterer. You gonna stone me? So Jacob picked up some pebbles and was like, tossed them at him real quick. So he's trying to do it, and it's to comedic effect, because we know that that's not even a good way to apply the Bible, just this blanket, literal. That there's more thought. To take the Bible seriously, you have to take it more seriously than that. But one of the fascinating things that comes out of it is when Jacob finds all the commands in the Old Testament about practicing gratitude to God. Now, to be clear, he's an agnostic. He doesn't even know if there's a God out there. Listen to what he says. He says, I'm obsessed with gratefulness. I can't stop. Just now, I press the elevator button, and I'm thankful that it arrives quickly. I get onto the elevator, and I'm thankful that the elevator cable didn't snap and plummet me to the basement. I go to the 5th floor, and I'm thankful that I didn't have to stop on the 2nd, 3rd, or 4th floor. I get out, and I'm thankful that Julie left the door unlocked, so I don't have to rummage for my King Kong keyring. I walk in, and I'm thankful that Jasper is home and healthy and stuffing his face with pineapple wedges. And on and on. I'm actually muttering to myself, thank you, thank you, thank you. It's an odd way to live, but also kind of great and powerful. I've never before been so aware of the thousands of little good things, the thousands of things that go right every day. He goes on to say, I've started to look at life differently. When you're thanking God for every little joy, every meal, every time you wake up, every time you take a sip of water, you can't help but be more thankful for life itself, for the unlikely and miraculous fact that you exist at all. So get this straight. An agnostic Jew, an agnostic from another religion, as a part of a bit that he was doing to write a book, starts practicing gratitude consistently. Still, we'll tell you, even in the book, I don't know what I'm sending this to. But goes through to follow the command to be grateful for all these things every day, and he finds himself radically affected by it. He finds his life being actually changed by it. He actually becomes sort of addicted to it. This agnostic Jew is now going through his life thanking the God he doesn't know if exists or not for everything that's happening in his life, and he can't stop. My brothers and sisters, we're awfully hard on those 9 lepers. Because I'm going to tell you, I read that and I laugh at the parts that are funny and all that, but there's this part of me in the back of my head that keeps saying, Do we need an agnostic from another religion to school us on gratitude? Is he out gratefuling us? Us who come every week, who talk about the story, who pray together, who sing these songs that remind us of the story we find ourselves in. Is the agnostic Jew for a bit out gratefuling us and frankly reaping all the benefits that we are passing on? Does Jesus look at us and wonder, seriously, are the rest of you just going on about your lives and the agnostic Jew? The agnostic from another religion is the one who's practicing gratitude like I called you to. Now, I don't actually want to live in a guilt trip, end in a guilt trip. I don't respond well to them myself. See? Myself. But what I want you to say, what I want you to hear, what I want you to enter into this week where we've got Thanksgiving, there's going to be turkey and food and lots of stuff to be grateful for. I want you to believe that what he describes is there for us. I want you to imagine for just a second if an agnostic from another religion can experience that kind of living, then what would happen if those of us who have been marinated in the story, who've encountered the saving grace and power of God, who believe that we have a living and active God who's taking the story somewhere, what would happen if we actually started practicing gratitude like we were called to in the first place? What would our lives, our impact, our influence look like in the world? And do you think that more people would be coming to us asking us to tell them about the hope that we have? Because if I were a betting man, I'd bet everything I got on it. But the only way we find out is if we do it. Emmons says, an additional essential aspect of gratitude is the notion of undeserved merit. When I am grateful, I recognize that I have no claim on the gift or benefit I received. It was freely bestowed out of compassion, generosity, or love. The theological term for this is grace. Perceive grace and you will naturally feel grateful. Grace is unearned. It is a free gift. If you believe in grace, you believe that there's a pattern of beneficence in the world that exists quite independently of your own striving and even your own existence. Gratitude thus depends upon receiving what we do not expect to receive or have not earned, or receiving more than we deserve or earned. So, may you develop eyes to see the goodness that surrounds you. May you learn to live under the assumption that every instance of that goodness is a gift from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights who does not change like shifting shadows. May you learn to trust that the God most clearly seen in Jesus is constantly working to bring about goodness in all situations. May you know that the God of grace is present even in the darkness when you can't see him and when you don't have any words to pray. May you make the choice to experience true joy by living a life of intentionally practiced gratitude, and may the God of hope fill you with joy and peace as you trust in him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. And the church said together, amen.